I come from a small city-state called Singapore. And if, like me, you live in the Asian tropical region, you will know that we have 4 seasons: hot season, hotter season, wet season, and exam season. Right, so in Singapore, we're famous for a few things, and one is our national examinations, right? So every student, every 12-year-old will have to do something called the primary school leaving examination. Sometimes, our students cry in the middle of the exam. Most of the times, it's the parents that's crying. The second thing that we're famous for, most recently, is that we now have the world's largest ceiling flush. And if you look really closely, the water there is made from the tears of all the students that have been crying in the exams. So exam season starts in October of every year, and this is when our students will take the national examination. And what's interesting to note is that most of the time in the maths examination, the last 5 questions are designed slightly differently, sometimes a bit challenging. So this is an example from an exact question that was used earlier this year, right? And the question is, fill in the graph above. So relatively simple. I see a pattern, figures 1 to 4. I'm going to draw figure 5. Then I'll count the number of white triangles and gray triangles. Not too bad, right? Part B, find the total number of gray and white triangles for figure 250. And this is a question that's designed for a 12-year-old. So now you can see why sometimes the parent is more stressed than the child. But questions like this aren't necessarily a bad thing, because 1, it helps the examiners to identify students which are particularly gifted in a specific topic or area. And 2, it shows to the students that sometimes you've got to think creatively. There's not always just one answer to the same question. So school teaches you a type of thinking called causal reasoning, which is 1 + 1 equals to blank. But when you graduate into this thing called life, use a different type of reasoning called effectual reasoning, which is blank + blank equals to 1. So you know where you want to be, there are laws and frameworks that you have to follow, but all of a sudden, there's no one right answer, and there are multiple ways to get there. A lot of students grapple with this and are not able to make this mindset change. So this is why, over the past 6 years, Reactor has been conducting entrepreneurship education programs for students aged 13 to 24. And as part of that demo day, the students have to present their startups and prototypes to a panel of investors and venture capitalists. We call this entrepreneurship education, or EntreEd. Not every student is going to be a co-founder or entrepreneur, but we believe that every student should be entrepreneurial. And the best way for this is to train them either by joining or building a startup. Because if you get students to be able to be comfortable with extreme levels of uncertainty, you set them up for success, regardless of whatever career they hope to do in future. So behind this and what we've been doing over the past few years is that we've developed a framework. We call this the 5 elements of entrepreneurship education. And what you notice is that these elements are opposites, almost like paradoxes. So for the first pair, we have fire and water. Fire that represents grit and resilience, bias to action. Entrepreneurs do something called being relentlessly resourceful, almost to the point of being stubborn. And the opposite of that is water, because water takes the shape of whatever container it's in. In this case, you're looking at adaptability and fluid intelligence, which is the ability to transpose knowledge and apply it to a completely different context. The next pair looks at air and earth. And air represents idealism, being visionary, and being curious, basically having a penchant for divergent ideas. Now, the opposite to that is earth, which requires you to be realistic and self-aware, not just only of your own limitations, but about the resources around you. Right in the center, that's where we have that 5th element, called being autodidactic. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what this means is that you have the ability to learn without the need of a formal teacher. And being autodidactic is a value that we want to instill in all our students, which is what we've been doing with over 70 schools all over ASEAN and Asia Pacific. So what happens when students work on an idea? Some of it are pretty interesting. So this is Lena. She's from Good Goblins. Lena is a Masters of Architecture student. But why is she on the floor sorting through rubbish? That's because she's building a mobile app called Good Goblins that helps people to learn how to better recycle. She does this by gamifying the process and getting them to understand what can and cannot be recycled. She's still in her very early stages now, but the feedback so far has been very encouraging because the households are asking her to continue the service so that they may better learn how to recycle. This is Elin and Domenica. They are from another company called Telile. Telile is an app that helps people who are deaf and mute to be able to access amenities such as banking, as well as making reservations. So for us, as able-bodied people, we take these things for granted because we have a sense of hearing. But for someone who is deaf or mute, it's difficult for them to get through their daily lives. So what they do is that they work with an interpreter that will do this signing for you live and will help to relay your message to a hearing user on the other end of the call. And next, we have Kahoot, which is an app that helps students in rural Vietnam to access career guidance knowledge and connections. How they do this is through a self-reporting tool that helps identify your strengths and weaknesses and then recommend activities on things you can do in your local area. Kahoot is started by a group of 18-year-olds in Ho Chi Minh. And believe it or not, they actually came up with this idea just 2 weeks ago at a hackathon that we designed for their school. So this is what... Sorry, could we go back, please? Stop, thanks. So this is what happens when we get our students to work on ideas. They produce projects that create social impact, not just for their community, but sometimes beyond. This represents a shift in education, where previously it was cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But the future, as students start to build projects, is constructo ergo sum. I build, therefore I am. I believe that we need to use technology as a force for good. Technology is changing the way in which we work, live, and play. So sometime in 2006, we finally created a technology that allowed us to be psychic. We can now read what's on everyone else's minds, whether we liked it or not. We call this, thanks. We call this Twitter, right? And in 2016, we had Pokemon Go. So this was the first app that received mass market adoption of augmented reality. But what most people didn't know was that sometime in 2012, we had another game that allowed you to catch monsters, and it's called Tinder. So you basically text your monster, and when you didn't like it anymore, you kind of just ignored it. So these are interesting technologies. But what if we could get students to work on difficult issues, such as hunger, unemployment, looking at sustainable development, as well as mental health issues for young people around the world? That is the crux of what we do. We believe that the world's biggest problem is that there are not enough young people solving the world's biggest problems. And startups are a great way to address that. So what happens when our students continue working on their projects? We hope that they start companies that create lasting positive change. So this is Joshua from Bantu. Bantu is a software that helps not-for-profits and voluntary welfare organizations to better manage and engage their volunteers. So it's been something he's been working on for some time, and recently their team has been in Bangkok to share at the Asia Pacific Regional Volunteer Conference about the best practices that they've seen working with charities and VWOs all around the world. I'm also very proud to share that Joshua is one of our alumni. Next up, we have Wei Jie from another social enterprise called Forward Coffee. So Wei Jie is the gentleman that's second from the left. Forward Coffee helps students with physical and mental disabilities to gain employment by teaching them F&B skills. They first started out by setting up pop-up kiosks which they do at events such as this. And over time, they've now evolved, and they have 4 stores where they help people with disabilities and young people with disabilities to get sustained jobs over time. Weijie has now been able to train dozens of youths all around Singapore to help them gain gainful employment. So this is where we find that alumni play a very important role because they are catalysts in the entire ecosystem. They help the students level up their ideas to produce projects that create social impact. And finally, this is the team from the NUS Entrepreneurship Society, or NES. They've started something really interesting called NES Startathon, which is Singapore's very first entrepreneurship program that's completely designed by students. So what happens is that if you go through this course for the course of 1 year, you get 4 academic units, and this is the students at their graduation pitch, where they pitch to a panel as well. And the entire program is completely designed and run by students, so there are no lecturers involved. So we're also very glad to share that as of 2 weeks ago, the NES team has graduated their first batch of students, and we hope that this will continue, so that these students then come back and help their juniors with their next round of ideas. So we realized that alumni play a very important role in helping their juniors, which is why we've since designed something called Nexus. It's an online tool that connects our students and alumni to mentors all around ASEAN. Our hope is that they will pay it forward and shine for others. And they need as much support and guidance as they can get. Why? Because technology is fundamentally changing how we live and work, and our classrooms need to change as well. So even though we are in a technologically and digitally advanced world today, our students still face a whole bunch of issues and problems. So the third part of this equation is the role of educators. Over the past few years, we've been training our educators to be able to use technological tools, and this is us bringing them to Apple and teaching them how to teach with iPads. We've also taught them to prototype both with web as well as mobile apps, which don't require them to code at all. We brought them through workshops where they learn experiential design through storytelling. And we've also brought them down to Changi Airport, and we showed them how design thinking was used as we designed the 4th terminal for the airport. Last year, we tried something really interesting. We started something called the Reactor Startup Immersion for Educators. And this was when we had the chance to send 12 educators to intern in 6 tech startups over the course of the week. At the end of the program, the teachers had to pitch to the CEOs about the business plans they developed. And this helped the educators to better understand what startups are like and what the future of work is going to be like for their students. So the learning doesn't stop. And it doesn't stop for the teachers, and it doesn't stop for the students. So we've got to basically evolve the education system one step at a time. And how we intend to accelerate this process is to organize Singapore's first education policy hackathon on 14th and 15th of March next year. This will be specifically made for school leaders and principals, and we hope that they will prototype the solutions in their schools and commit to lasting change. Some of the things that we're hoping that the principals will think about would be, could we introduce ASEAN languages as a 3rd language? Instead of detention, can we replace this with meditation? Could we get students to intern in social enterprises as part of their final year project? That change is going to take time, and it's something that we feel that all of us should be committed towards. So if you look at these various statements, individually, they may seem standalone, but collectively, they form a system where students turn their ideas into projects and their projects into companies. This produces alumni, with the help of educators, come back to help their juniors to take their ideas to the next level. And we do this for our students because they will inherit the world that we build today. Evolving the education system is going to be a long and arduous process, but that hard work starts now. Why? Because when the right elements are brought together in the right environment, a reaction occurs. It takes a village to raise a child, and an ecosystem to cultivate the galaxy's best young founders. Thank you.